I've got an old barn today. I'm going to do a little bit more of pen and wash. So the photograph that I've taken, I've got in portrait, but I've actually extended the picture into landscape because I think it suits it better. You've got to ignore the washing line there that's coming across. So a little bit of perspective, I want you to just roughly draw it out. It's quite simple perspective, and it helps to look at this line here, this line being horizontal. So that's helpful. Then you've got a line coming this way towards the vanishing point and a line coming this way towards the vanishing point. So that's quite helpful, that horizontal line there. There's a bit of variation in the roof lines, just of those two, but it's a nice simple one for you to have a go at. So draw out the barn. I've extended this line of the grass a bit further and then made up a couple of shrubs just here. Very distant, loose shrubbery, and then just an idea of where these tree trunks are going to be. So we're going to do a little bit of pen and wash. So I've got my sepia FW ink ready. If you haven't got that, or you don't want to use the ink, then you can just use a bit of sepia watercolour. I've also got my sepia waterproof pen at hand as well. I've got my trusty knitting needle ready to go with the ink. Colours wise, I've got cobalt blue and burnt sienna mixed to make a grey, burnt sienna on its own, raw sienna on its own, then just some tiny touches neat on the palette here of gamboge, sap green and alizarin crimson. So they're the colours that I've got. So I've got my loose sketch. I'm going to quickly lay on some washes to start with. So I'm coming around the barn and over all of the trees and the sky. We've done a couple of pen and wash now, and you'll realise that I like to get a bit of colour on quite quickly because I think it means that you don't go too mad with the pen. So it's quite a big area that you're covering in water, so make sure you take your time to make sure you've got plenty of water on. You don't necessarily want it puddling, but you do need it to stay wet. Missed a couple of bits there. Okay, and check your brush is nice and clean. Okay, so I'm going to come in with a little bit of raw sienna to start with. So I'm thinking horizon line. And these lower shrubs. If you want that little bit of a pinkier tone in the sky, I've got a little bit of permanent rose just left on my palette. Just a dab of that just into this raw sienna. Or just give it that pinkier tone. There's a little bit of pink in the sky. Just down there. Give my brush a rinse. I'm going to come into the cobalt blue. You want plenty of cobalt blue on. It's not so bad today if the raw sienna mixes with the blue. You're making green, you're doing trees in the background, so it's not the end of the world. Having a little bit of green in a sky that's got trees in. So pretty much covering that area. I'm going to then come into my grey, give it a little bit of a stir, and that's circular motion. So it's a little bit of an overcast day. This is just down the lane from me, an old farm. It's got some nice barns on. Barns are always good for pen and wash. It's a great one to do. So a little bit of grey going in there. I'm also going to take a little bit of grey where there would be distant shrubbery, just so it starts to build that up. Not so much into the foreground shrubbery, I'll bring that in later, but into the distance. It's good to have that in there. Okay, I'm just going to get some of the sepia ink. I'm just going to start to bring in some lines. Now this might make you panic, but these are soft, so you want these to be soft in the background, and as we're working you will see these soften in. So you need to make sure that this is where I'm using my knitting needle. I'm just starting to get a few little bits in here. The beauty of the ink is it granulates and it splits out and it makes some really lovely effects. So I don't want you to be scared of it if you're using it, because it does have some absolutely wonderful effects. And this is just your base. Where we've got this extended shrubbery here, I just want you to make a little bit up. You just want a little bit, you can taper it out really. You can see what it's doing already. It's got some fabulous effects on here. Don't be afraid to go across one another. You can come in with a brush as well in a minute. You just want to make sure you've got a few of these finer lines on. You can work with those later. Rinse off my knitting needle. So I've just got a round number 6. Just whilst it's still wet, I can come in a little bit and just start to create some of the tree branches, any other little bits of shrubbery. You don't need to do the whole thing, but this additional softness works well later on. And remember, when this dries it's permanent, so you're not going to lift it. So in that way it works quite well. Okay, so I'm happy with that. I'm going to dry that off now. Okay, so that's dried nicely now. I'm going to carry on getting a bit of a base of colour on. So I'm coming over the barn area, avoiding the door, but everywhere else I'm capturing the roof and the walls. It's a little bit of water. I've got my trusty salt pot ready just to get a little bit of texture in here. So this is the burnt sienna going on now. You could, if you wanted to, use light red. There's no reason why I haven't used it really today. I've just kept it to the basic colours. I know some of you haven't got light red, but you could use it if you've got it. It would work quite nicely. Burnt sienna works just as well. So you're just coming over the whole of the barn, bar the door. And we're going to sprinkle a bit of salt on in a second when we've got a bit more colour on. Rustic barns always work really well in pen and wash. Okay, so you can dab into your grey. Just dab a bit of that in places just to give a little bit more variation. You can also dab into a little bit of alizarin crimson if you want to, and just touch that in places. You don't want to go mad. If you're using light red, you probably won't put any of the alizarin crimson in. This is just your textured base really. So we're just getting a little bit of variation in there. And then you've got my trusty salt pot. Sprinkle of salt. I'm just going to sprinkle it on. Everything else is dry, so I don't have to be too concerned about where it's going. I just want that little bit of texture. So sprinkle finely, and then we're just going to let that dry, and it will pull out the paint. Okay, so whilst that's drying, I'm going to start to work a little bit more into the trees. I've twisted upside down because I find it easier to paint downwards, and I've got my sepia ink, and I'm going to start to come into these trees here. Now you don't want to come right the way to the bottom because you don't want to lose that softness from the flow of the paint. And you don't want to eliminate everything that's there. So it's just about being careful and coming in to start to create some harder branches. So I'm started with my round number 6, and I'll work down to my line writer or rigger. Just where it's soft, you can just do a jaggedy bottom. Say a jaggedy bottom on a tree. So don't just do a straight line. And don't just follow the line you've already put on. So you be brave and come out of it. And then you'll get this softness behind. Again, jaggedy bottom. This is for your much sharper branches. Just remember to keep rinsing if you're using the ink so that you don't affect your brushes, because it's acrylic, it will dry on your brushes. So it's good practice for your trees. Remember to overlap some of them. If you want to have a wet brush at hand, if you want to then touch any of these to make them spread a little bit, you can do. It does work nicely. That combination of hard and soft. The more you practice trees, the better you get. Again, dab in. Okay, so I've carried along here, and what I just want to show you as well is another little technique where you dab in a little bit of water. You can do this after the rest of it's dry, and then you just come on at the end with your line writer and you're just creating these little sort of fine foliage bits by just dabbing a little bit in and letting it just make a little explosion. You can do this wherever. And it just starts to create that sort of fine foliage effect. I always say the same thing, which is less is more. You're better not to go over the top. But I know some of you won't be able to resist the temptation of just fiddling at this stage. Okay, so I'm quite happy with those trees. I'm going to turn that back round now and let it dry. Okay, so that's dried off nicely now. I'm just going to draw my attention back to this bit here now, which is the closer foliage. I'm going to say we've already got some raw sienna on there. I'm going to pick up a touch of the Gamboge yellow, and I'm going into this now with a loaded brush of water with a touch of Gamboge yellow, and I'm not putting any more water on, I'm going in dry. And then I'm going to pick up a touch of cobalt blue, so the cobalt blue from the sky is fine, and just bring that through. You want it to look green. You don't want it to be too blue, so if it looks too strong, take a bit more yellow in. But I want you to just let those colours mix. So you've got a much more natural effect. I don't want you to just mix the colours on the palette. And then with my round number 6, I'm just going to dip into some of the sepia ink. I'm just going to take it in places at the bottom. So this is quite wet, so it's running nicely, which is exactly what I want it to do. So I'm just touching random places at the bottom. I want you to especially get a nice bit of ink into this area here, because that dark is going to bring out the side of the barn really nicely. can see that that's flowed quite a lot. I've got my water spritzer. You don't have to use a spritzer, you can soften in, but it does work quite nicely if you can just get that top edge a little bit. You see flowing? So it's just giving it that bit more random effect. I'm going to dry that off. Okay, so that's nicely dried now. Just so that I get a base on this bottom section, I'm going to pop a bit of water on. Then dip into the Gamboge yellow. And then I've got some neat sap green on my palette as well, so I'm just going to dip into that. Just keep your brush quite loaded with water. And then it won't be too vibrant. You want it to be brighter though, because it's towards the front of the picture. Try not to eliminate all the yellow. I want some of that to show through still. With your round number 6, just get a tiny bit of ink. I'm just looking at these little bits on the barn here. So I just want you to dot just at the top of the barn, and it's going to blend a little bit into, it's at the bottom of the barn, sorry, a little bit into the grassy area. So it's just grounding it a bit. It's working quite nicely. Take a bit under the door there as well. And then just pop a bit of water on my round number 10, and I'm just going to touch the top because I don't want it to be hard along there or too hard. And just the door I'm leaving, but I'm just touching the top just so that it softens both sides. Just come in a little bit, you'll see that a bit better. Okay, I'm going to dry that one off. So I've got a close up on the barn now. I'm going to come in to do a little bit on that. I've got my ink and my knitting needle, and I'm going to come along and start to create some of these edges. Now, what's great about this knitting needle is it's quite random. I like the randomness. You don't want too much of to be drawn in pen, so this is giving you the opportunity to have this random effect. So I'm wiggling a little bit as I go, so I start to create the rustic roof. You're not outlining, you're picking out the dark areas. So I don't want you to see you going all the way around the edges, you're just picking out the dark. And I've got a little bit of a window here, bit one there, and a little bit of one there. Where I will allow you to take a little bit of dark is down this section where you've got the ivy growing, because that will work wonderfully for ink. So I'm just coming on, creating that effect. I'm just going to rinse off my knitting needle This could be a big fail, but I'm going to try. I want to spritz this ivy a little bit. That's working quite nicely. I'll just get my line writer whilst it's still damp. Just want to add to the effect. It's spreading a little bit. And then just with a wet line writer, I'm just going to fill in the rest of this wooden shutter, just so it blends that bit a little bit. I'll dry that off and then I'm going to come back in with my pen. Okay, so we're back in with my pen now. What we're looking for really is a variety of marks, and those marks to add to the texture. You're not outlining. So I'm going to do some wiggles for tiles here, but not a lot, and a few more wiggles underneath for a bit more, some darker marks. The one place where I will let you outline is around the door, because it lends quite well to that. And then there's a little bit of a window, a few little marks, a little bit. So I'm putting some panelling on the door, but I'm not hitting everywhere. There's something on the wall there, a little bit of something under there. You can add a few directional marks on the roof. Bit along the top. Everybody's interpretation will be different, but you just don't want to do every single tile. You just want a little indication. Even one corner works if you just concentrate on the near side corner. Just remember to follow the direction of the perspective as well. So as you come up, you're following this line more. I concentrate on just getting a bit on this sort of near side, and as you come down you're following the bottom roof line a little bit more. Then you've got the angle this way. Just those few little bits. These are slanting away a little bit more. I won't do too much with that wall. Brickwork wise, I'd concentrate, if you want, a few little bits to pop them around the door, around the shutters or windows. Do not go mad. Few little marks. Up to you whether you want to do any marks within here. Doesn't necessarily need it. I like the effect that I've got. Obviously you can come on and create some really fine branches nice and easily. On this tree line as well, which which works quite nicely. You see I'm wiggling, not thinking about it too much, referencing the photo a little bit. Obviously they need to come from a branch and not be floating. But the less you think about it, the more random it will look and the more it will work. So I'm just really looking at giving a little bit of balance now, because I've started on this, so it needs to go all the way through. When you've got these beautiful bits where the light is glowing through, that works really nicely. Okay, that works nicely there. And then I need to pop a few little bits of shadow on. So I've got my round number 6. I'm going to come into the grey. So if I capture this side here with a bit of shadow to start with. A little bit more shadow just under the roof line. More grey down there, and then I've got the alizarin crimson, and just make sure you're not coming on too wet with that. The top of the door there's some glass in there, so I'll come in with some blue once that's dry. I'm just dropping a little bit of grey into the alizarin crimson because I don't want it to be too strong. Okay, I'll dry that off. I'm very nearly there now. I've dried that off. I'm going to pop a wash of blue just over that window section at the top there, and then I'm gonna do another glaze of burnt sienna. It feels like these could do with a little bit. In fact, I'm going to do burnt sienna with a touch of alizarin crimson just over these roofs, just to give them a little bit more oomph. So I'm just taking this on to dry. Because the ink's all dry, it's not going to move. And if I get an odd bit where it's not caught, I quite like that. I'm going to leave that. Gives it a little bit more light there. Okay, I think we're about done. Just try and come back out so you can see the whole thing. See you next week.